The boy who wanted to split the world. The summer air in suburban Detroit carried the familiar scent of cut grass, warm asphalt, and the thin chemical trace of the factories that dotted the horizon. In the broad, tree-lined neighborhoods of Clinton Township, nothing appeared extraordinary. The houses were modest, the streets quiet, and the people content in the ordinary American rhythm of work, rest, and repetition. Yet inside one of those houses lived a boy whose imagination was determined to shatter that rhythm. His name was David Hahn, and he would be remembered as the teenager who tried to build a nuclear reactor in his mother's backyard. The story of David Hahn begins long before radiation meters chirped in a Michigan driveway and government agents sealed off a suburban tool shed. It begins with a restless curiosity, the kind that unsettles teachers, frustrates parents, and pulls a young mind toward the edges of what is possible. Long before newspapers called him the Radioactive Boy Scout, David was simply a boy who wondered how the world worked, down to the smallest particle. David grew up between two households, navigating the complicated landscape of divorced parents. His father, Ken, lived a few miles away with his new wife. His mother, Patty, lived in a small house where David spent most of his time. Neither home was wealthy, neither was particularly stable, and in both places David felt the familiar loneliness that often shadows children who move between two worlds. Yet if his family life provided little foundation, his mind created one of its own. The moment he discovered chemistry, a quiet obsession took root. At first it was innocent. He read simple science books, checked out library guides on atoms and elements, and learned to mix rudimentary compounds. But as he grew older, his ambitions outpaced the materials available to him. He began ordering books far beyond his age level, dense volumes about nuclear physics, reactor design, and radiation. Where other boys taped posters of football players on their walls, David taped the periodic table and diagrams of atomic structure. He wanted more than knowledge. He wanted mastery. One evening, while flipping through an old Boy Scout manual, he noticed the badge for atomic energy. It was a relic of the Cold War era, a badge once intended to teach American youths the basics of radiation safety and nuclear science. To most modern scouts, it was obscure and unnecessary. To David, it was a calling. If the badge required understanding radioactive materials, then he would not merely understand them. He would obtain them. He would experiment with them. He would see for himself what the invisible world inside the atom looked like when its secrets were forced out into the open. His mother had little idea what to make of his passion. She knew he was smart, though perhaps not smart in the safe ways that made teachers praise and grandparents brag. Hard-working but inconsistent, brilliant but easily distracted, David lived in a state of perpetual mental restlessness. He tinkered constantly, dismantling radios, microwaves, and smoke detectors, often leaving the parts strewn across the house like the remains of small mechanical animals. When she asked what he was doing, he answered with explanations so dense she could only nod politely. His father worried, but not deeply. He believed David's experiments were harmless, a phase like any other. After all, he had once been a curious boy too. What harm could a little chemistry set do? It was not a little chemistry set. Even before puberty, David had built a small but powerful lab in his bedroom, complete with beakers, burners, and chemicals he somehow managed to purchase or extract. When his parents expressed concern about the stains appearing on the carpet or the burns appearing on his desk, David simply moved his operations to the garage. When the garage became too cluttered, he moved into the backyard shed, a place no one else cared much about. It smelled of old fertilizer and rusted tools, but to David, it was the sanctuary where he could think freely, a door he could close, a place where no one would bother him. By the time he reached high school, David's fascination with chemistry had transformed into a fixation on radioactivity. To him, it was not a destructive force, but a profound mystery. The idea that energy stored inside the nucleus of an atom could power cities or obliterate them captivated him. He wanted to understand it in the same way a climber wants to understand a mountain, not from a textbook, but from the experience of standing on its summit. The challenges he faced only fueled him further. Radioactive materials were strictly regulated. The average citizen could not simply purchase uranium or thorium or americium for home experiments. But David was resourceful. He discovered that certain everyday items contained small amounts of radioactive substances. He learned to extract them. He found ways to purify them. He improvised crude but effective methods for concentrating them far beyond what any adult would have imagined possible for a teenager working alone. He was careful, but not careful enough. He was knowledgeable, but far from fully understanding the dangers. He was determined, and that determination pushed him toward a dream that few adults would dare entertain: building a breeder reactor. The notion began as an idea scribbled in one of his notebooks. A breeder reactor, unlike a standard reactor, could create more fissile fuel than it consumed. It was an advanced technology, the kind used in high-level nuclear research. To David, it was the ultimate expression of scientific achievement. He believed that if he could build one, even a tiny one, even an experimental one, it would prove something, not only to his teachers or his family, but to himself. If the world would not recognize his intelligence, the atom would. Throughout the early months of 1994, David intensified his experiments. At school, he appeared unremarkable, awkward, quiet, often exhausted. Teachers sometimes wondered why he seemed so distracted. Few guessed that his mind was occupied with neutron sources, shielding materials, and the mathematics of critical mass. While other students worried about homework or weekend plans, David spent his nights studying reactor blueprints and decoding obscure scientific papers. His pursuit of radioactive materials became increasingly bold. Smoke detectors were one of his earliest sources. Inside each detector was a pea-sized amount of americium-241, a mildly radioactive isotope used to detect changes in air ionization. David collected dozens of detectors, extracting the americium through methods that would have alarmed any trained professional. He dismantled old clock dials for radium, bought lantern mantles for thorium, and located small deposits of naturally occurring uranium through creative, sometimes deceptive correspondence with scientific suppliers. He learned to separate isotopes with simple tools. He created rudimentary purification systems with makeshift filters and heating coils. The shed filled slowly with jars of powders, metal shavings, chemical solutions, and equipment that looked suspicious enough to draw questions from anyone who happened to glance inside. But no one did. The shed remained his secret laboratory, an island of ambition, hidden in an ordinary American backyard. The closer he came to assembling his reactor, the more he withdrew from the outside world. Friendships faded. School performance slipped. Nothing mattered except the project. His mother sensed something was changing. She saw the shadows under his eyes, the strange burns on his hands, the chemical odor clinging to his clothes. She asked if he was all right, and he always said he was fine. He simply needed time alone, he insisted. He was working on a science project, something for the Scouts. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. Raising a teenage boy alone was difficult enough without imagining that he might be handling materials capable of poisoning him. So she let him work, checking in occasionally, unaware of the danger growing in her own backyard.
The closer he came to assembling his reactor, the more he withdrew from the outside world. Friendships faded. School performance slipped. Nothing mattered except the project. His mother sensed something was changing. She saw the shadows under his eyes, the strange burns on his hands, the chemical odor clinging to his clothes. She asked if he was all right, and he always said he was fine. He simply needed time alone, he insisted. He was working on a science project, something for the Scouts. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. Raising a teenage boy alone was difficult enough without imagining that he might be handling materials capable of poisoning him. So she let him work, checking in occasionally, unaware of the danger growing in her own backyard. By mid-1994, David constructed his first crude neutron source. It was an improvised device, assembled from scavenged parts and concentrated radioactive material. When he powered it on, he felt the thrill of accomplishment flood through him. The device emitted neutrons, proof that he could manipulate atomic reactions through his own design. It was a small success, but to David it was monumental. It confirmed that the reactor might truly be possible. He pressed forward with renewed determination. To create a functional breeder reactor, he needed a core with a neutron-rich environment. He packed ceramic balls containing thorium and uranium into a lead-lined assembly. He positioned his neutron source strategically inside it. He arranged reflectors and moderators, attempting to mimic the configuration he had studied in scientific texts. The moment he activated it, the system behaved in ways he did not fully anticipate. It began producing more radiation than he had measured before. The readings on his makeshift Geiger counter climbed rapidly. He assumed this meant he was succeeding. In a sense, he was, but success in the realm of nuclear physics brings risks that exceed the understanding of most amateur scientists. The radiation levels in the shed increased steadily over the following weeks. David noticed his counter clicking loudly any time he entered. The air felt heavier. The soil near the shed tested hotter than normal. Something was happening beyond his control. Maybe he had created a partial reaction. Maybe isotopes within the core were undergoing slow transmutation. Maybe the configuration was becoming unstable. He was thrilled, but he was also troubled. He had always believed he could control the process, but now he sensed that the project was drifting beyond his grasp. He worried about drawing attention. He worried about the possibility, remote but terrifying, that the reaction could escalate. And then, in August of 1994, the situation finally caught up with him. Police officers found him late one night examining materials in the trunk of his car. They questioned him. His answers were evasive. In their confusion, they searched the car and found measuring instruments, powders, containers, and tools that seemed suspicious. Unsure of what they were looking at, but certain it was not normal, they called for assistance. Soon, the story of the teenage boy with radioactive materials spread through local law enforcement. The officers feared they had stumbled into something dangerous. They alerted federal authorities. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission sent investigators. The Environmental Protection Agency prepared a response team. The reactor, the shed, the backyard, every part of David's secret world was about to be exposed. And nothing would ever be the same again.
The officers who stopped David that night had not expected trouble. They were patrolling the quiet streets, watching for the usual disturbances of summer: speeding teenagers, loud parties, curfew violations. The boy they encountered was thin, pale, and nervous, but he did not appear dangerous. At first, they assumed they were dealing with petty mischief, but the objects inside his car did not fit any familiar category of wrongdoing. Radiation detectors, chemical solutions, glass vials wrapped in tape, tools filed down to precise shapes, instruction sheets that looked like they belonged in a university lab. When questioned, David stumbled over his explanations. He spoke too quickly, too vaguely, and too scientifically for the officers to follow. His insistence that he was working on a Boy Scout project only deepened their suspicion. It was nearing midnight, and the warm Michigan air carried a stillness that made the situation feel strangely unreal. The officers were not trained to identify radioactive material, but experience told them that whatever this was, it should not have been in the trunk of a teenager's car. To be safe, they confiscated the items. Then, according to departmental procedure, they reported the incident to their superiors. The report moved upward, passing through hands that recognized the word radioactive with increasing alarm. By the following morning, the inquiry had reached offices where the significance of each material became clear: americium, thorium, uranium. These were not the components of a school science fair project. The authorities decided to investigate the place where David claimed he conducted his experiments. Officers were sent to his mother's house to inspect the shed he had mentioned. At first glance, it looked ordinary: weathered wood, hinged door slightly offline, surrounded by weeds and old gardening supplies. But the moment they entered, they sensed something was wrong. The air felt stale, with a faint metallic tang. Dust clung to the corners in an unusually heavy layer, as if it contained something denser than simple dirt. A Geiger counter chirped softly. Then it chirped faster. Then it began clicking so rapidly that the sound blended into a stuttering buzz. The officers stepped back immediately. The shed was emitting radiation. Within hours, the situation shifted from a local matter to a federal concern. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Environmental Protection Agency were contacted. Emergency response teams were assembled. Clinton Township, a place unaccustomed to national attention, found itself under the watch of specialists in protective suits. At first, neighbors were told little. They saw unfamiliar vehicles arriving, men in white suits moving in measured steps, and officers securing the perimeter of the yard. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered about a meth lab. Others joked nervously about alien artifacts. Nobody imagined a teenager had been building a nuclear device behind the house where children played only yards away. David's mother, Patty, was devastated. She watched in confusion as the men entered her property, carrying equipment she had only seen in disaster documentaries. She tried to explain that her son was simply passionate about science. She insisted it was all a misunderstanding. The officials listened politely, but did not believe her. Radiation does not misunderstand. They opened the shed and began cataloging its contents. What they found was startling. Jars of powders labeled with chemical symbols. Tools modified for extraction and refinement. Dismantled smoke detectors stripped of their americium cores. Lantern mantles blackened from heating piled in a corner. Metal containers holding substances far more radioactive than any unlicensed civilian should possess. A crude neutron source crafted out of materials that no teenager should have been able to acquire. The radiation levels varied throughout the shed. Some areas clicked gently. Others spiked dangerously. It was clear that the structure had been contaminated over time, not through a single incident, but through repeated experiments that had gradually saturated the environment with radioactive particles. Soil samples taken around the shed showed elevated readings, suggesting that the materials had spread beyond the walls.
The investigators were astonished, not only because of the radiation, but because of the ingenuity required to create such an environment. This was not a random collection of hazardous waste. It was the remains of a fully realized project, an attempt to build a working reactor. The scope of what David had attempted was both impressive and alarming. Some officials referred to him as a prodigy, others as a threat. Most simply did not know what to make of a teenager who had come so close to replicating processes normally confined to government laboratories. The cleanup effort began soon after the assessment. A team specialized in radioactive waste arrived from multiple states. They treated the backyard as if it were the site of a small-scale nuclear incident. Workers in protective suits dismantled the shed piece by piece, sealing each board and tool inside thick containers marked with hazardous material labels. The contaminated soil was dug up in sections and removed. The grass was cut away. Even the air was sampled repeatedly, ensuring that no particles had drifted toward neighboring properties. Patty watched with a mix of fear and guilt. She had always known her son was different, but she had never imagined this. She questioned herself constantly. Had she ignored the signs? Had she trusted him too much? Had she allowed loneliness or exhaustion to blind her to the dangers? She tried to speak with the officials, to understand what would happen to her son, but they could tell her little. Most of their focus was on containing the contamination. David, for his part, withdrew into himself. He answered questions only when necessary. He avoided eye contact. He felt the weight of the consequences pressing down on him. Yet even in the midst of the chaos, he seemed more upset that his project had been dismantled than he was afraid of punishment. He understood, in a theoretical sense, the dangers he had created, but his obsession had always dulled his fear. He had believed he could control the risks. Now the professionals were telling him that he had placed himself and others in harm's way. The cleanup effort took months. The shed was ultimately deemed too contaminated to ever be reused. It was classified as radioactive waste and shipped to a secure disposal facility in Utah, along with the soil, tools, and debris. The cost was extraordinary, far beyond what his family could afford. The government covered much of it, but the stain of the event lingered. The property would forever be associated with the incident. Neighbors whispered about it, long after the suits and trucks were gone. In school, the story spread quickly. Overnight, David became an odd mix of celebrity and cautionary tale. Some students admired him, calling him a genius. Others feared him, wondering what he might have been capable of if he had succeeded. Teachers watched him with new unease. Administrators worried about liability. He returned to class, but the atmosphere had changed. He felt like an outsider in a place where he had once been merely a quiet student. The federal investigation continued for months, though no criminal charges were filed. Officials concluded that he had acted without malicious intent. He was not a would-be bomber or saboteur. He was simply a teenager whose curiosity had outgrown his understanding. Yet the incident left a mark on every agency involved. It became a case study, a reminder that intelligence without guidance can drift into dangerous territory. David tried to resume a normal life, but normalcy eluded him. The shed had been his sanctuary, the one place where he felt in control. Without it, he felt adrift. He attempted new projects, but none provided the same thrill. The materials he once used were now off limits. His parents monitored him closely. The authorities kept informal watch. The freedom he had once enjoyed was gone. Still, the story of what he had accomplished lingered in his mind. He had built a neutron source. He had created a reaction. He had captured the attention of the federal government. He believed that meant something. He believed it proved his potential. Yet he did not know how to use that potential in a world that feared his ambition. And as the months passed, he began to turn away from the precise, focused work that had defined his early life. Something inside him shifted. The brilliance remained, but the discipline faltered. The path before him darkened, not with radiation, but with uncertainty. In the months following the cleanup, David Hahn tried to piece together a version of life that resembled normalcy. But normalcy, once broken, rarely returns. The shed was gone, the tools were gone, the materials were gone. Yet the habits of thought he had cultivated for years did not disappear with the debris hauled away to Utah. His mind continued to churn, searching for a problem to solve, a mystery to unravel, a boundary to push. The adults around him hoped the incident would mark the end of his dangerous experiments. His mother prayed he would redirect his intelligence towards safer pursuits. His father encouraged him to consider engineering or science programs in the future, imagining that a structured education might provide the discipline he lacked. His teachers suggested advanced classes. His scout leaders tried to steer him toward projects that required teamwork and supervision. But David did not adapt well to direction. He struggled with authority, not out of rebellion, but because he felt misunderstood. When he spoke about science, his explanations spiraled into complexities that left listeners behind. He knew more than most adults expected a teenager could know, yet not enough to grasp the limits of his own knowledge. That space between brilliance and naivete was the space where he had built his reactor, and it was still there, waiting. The incident changed how others viewed him. At school, classmates whispered about the radioactive boy. Some avoided him. Others approached him with curious admiration, asking questions he found tedious. A few wanted to provoke him, to see if the rumors were true, if he was as strange as people said. He hated all of it. He had wanted recognition, but not this. He had wanted respect, but not fear. He had wanted to prove something, but what he had proved was that he could cause chaos without intending to. He felt trapped by the image others had of him, an image he had accidentally created. The government's involvement left a deeper scar. Though he was not charged, he knew his name exists in federal files. Agencies would remember him. People in uniforms would not forget the teenager who built a radioactive experiment in his backyard. He imagined invisible eyes watching him, waiting to see if he would cross another line. Whether or not he was truly monitored, he believed he was, and the belief alone was enough to alter his behavior. He tried to continue his education. For a time he succeeded, but concentration had never come easily to him unless driven by obsession. Without a singular project consuming his thoughts, the structure of school felt hollow. His grades, once mediocre but passable, began to slip. He skipped assignments. He disengaged in class. Teachers noticed, but they struggled to reach him. He was present physically, but his mind drifted elsewhere. His family saw the changes too. His mother noticed he slept poorly. He spent long hours alone, sometimes in the basement, sometimes wandering the neighborhood at night. His father tried to intervene, offering guidance and discipline, but the distance between them had grown. He listened politely, but rarely absorbed the advice. The stability he needed was elusive. In time, he graduated high school, though barely. The day he received his diploma felt anticlimactic. There were no celebrations, no plans for college. He stood on the football field in his cap and gown, watching classmates embrace their families and pose for photographs. He felt like an observer rather than a participant, as though life was happening around him, not to him. He held the diploma in his hands, feeling nothing.
Work was the next step. He took a job at a fast food restaurant, then another at a discount store. He moved through positions without enthusiasm. Supervisors described him as quiet, intelligent, and unfocused. He made mistakes not out of incompetence, but out of distraction. He seemed to operate in two worlds, one mundane and physical, the other abstract and internal. He considered joining the military. His father encouraged the idea, believing it might provide the discipline and direction he lacked. The structure of service, the routine, the hierarchy, perhaps these would anchor him. David agreed. At 19, he enlisted in the Navy. Boot camp was a shock. The rigid schedule, constant demands, and strict discipline clashed with his restless nature. Yet he persevered. He learned to follow orders. He learned to rely on routine. He found moments of focus, but his mind still wandered. He spent quiet hours reading physics books he brought with him or borrowed from base libraries. He asked questions that perplexed his peers and irritated his superiors. In this time in the Navy, he never attempted anything like the reactor. He lacked the materials and the freedom to pursue such projects. But his curiosity simmered beneath the surface. He asked about radiation safety protocols. He studied equipment manuals with unusual attention. When he spoke about nuclear engineering, his tone shifted from monotone to animated. His peers had mixed impressions. Some thought he was brilliant but strange. Others considered him eccentric, maybe unstable. A few admired his intellect, yet none truly understood the depth of his obsession. After his service, he drifted through various jobs and faced recurring personal struggles. The world he had entered as a young adult was far less forgiving than the world of his childhood experiments. Bills replaced notebooks. Responsibilities replaced curiosity. The shed had given him purpose. Without it, he searched for meaning in places where his mind did not belong. Over time, he developed symptoms that suggested deeper psychological issues, symptoms that went untreated. He grew more withdrawn, more erratic. The stability he had temporarily found in the Navy evaporated. His attempts to rebuild his life faltered. Despite everything, he never fully let go of his fascination with radiation. In later years, he would again attract attention when authorities discovered he had been dismantling smoke detectors in his apartment, collecting small amounts of americium as he had once done as a teenager. It was far less ambitious than a reactor, but it was a sign that he had never escaped the gravitational pull of his obsession. Neighbors complained. Officials intervened. His mental state deteriorated further. The boy who had once been hailed as a prodigy and feared as a risk now seemed caught in a spiral he could not escape. The brilliance of his youth had become a shadow, haunting him. Yet long before his eventual decline, long before his name faded into the margins of cautionary tales, the memory of what he had accomplished as a teenager remained vivid in the minds of those who had witnessed it. Nuclear engineers discussed his project with a mixture of disbelief and concern. Teachers used his story as an example of what unchecked curiosity can lead to. Parents cited him when warning their children about dangerous experiments. What David had done in that shed was extraordinary. Too extraordinary to be forgotten, too dangerous to be repeated, too complex to be easily defined. He had not been trying to build a weapon. He had not intended harm. He had been seeking understanding, pushing himself to decipher a realm of science far beyond the reach of most adults, let alone a boy. And in doing so, he revealed both the potential and the peril of unbridled intellect. He had built something remarkable. He had also built something hazardous. He had crossed a boundary not out of malice, but out of ambition, and the consequences followed him for the rest of his life. But the final chapters of his story, the ones that would cement his legacy as the radioactive Boy Scout, were still ahead. The world had not yet seen the last of David Hahn. In the years that followed his initial brush with national attention, David Hahn's story began to drift into the realm of legend. People who had never met him spoke of him with a mixture of fascination and confusion. Documentary producers requested interviews. Journalists tracked down neighbors. Amateur scientists debated whether his reactor had truly functioned or whether it was merely an elaborate experiment that had spiraled dangerously close to catastrophe. The truth, complicated and fragile, always lay somewhere between extremes. Meanwhile, David moved through life like a figure half present, half absent. He lived quietly, drifting between jobs, friends, and routines. To the people he met, he was polite but distant, intelligent but distracted, present but somehow not fully grounded. He seemed to operate in two worlds. He seemed like someone who had once known exactly what he wanted and then lost it without knowing how. His childhood brilliance remained a part of him, but it no longer guided him. Instead, it flickered like a distant memory, a light behind a fogged window. Sometimes it broke through, such as when he worked on mechanical tasks or solved puzzles that others struggled with. But more often it was buried under the weight of uncertainty and the residue of a mind that had once ignited itself on an impossible ambition. The memory of the shed stayed with him as both triumph and regret. It was the place where he had felt most alive, where he had touched the edges of nuclear science with his bare hands, where he had believed he might change the world. But it was also where he had unknowingly crossed into danger, where government agencies had descended upon his family home, where contamination had seeped into the soil and into the future of everyone associated with the incident. In quiet moments, he replayed the events in his mind. He remembered the hum of makeshift devices, the thrill of watching a Geiger counter leap to life, the pride of creating something no teenager should have attempted. He also remembered the fear, soft at first, then overwhelming, the night the police found him with materials in his car. He remembered the suits in his backyard, the dismantling of his sanctuary, the expression on his mother's face as she watched it all unfold. He had wanted to be seen as brilliant. Instead, he was seen as reckless. Yet, even as he drifted through adulthood, the world outside continued to shape his legacy. In 1998, a long-form article about his experiments appeared in a national magazine. The piece was detailed, dramatic, often sympathetic, and deeply compelling. It introduced him to readers across the country not as a threat, but as a misunderstood prodigy, a boy who pursued knowledge without guidance, without fear, and without resources beyond what he could scavenge. The article transformed David Hahn from a local curiosity into a national icon of eccentric genius. Scientists debated the accuracy of the reporting. Teachers passed the article around in staff rooms. College students reposted excerpts online. The phrase, "the Radioactive Boy Scout," took on a life of its own. It was repeated in television specials, science blogs, and high school chemistry classrooms. David himself knew the article existed. He read it. He understood why people found it fascinating. But he also felt exposed. The writer had captured his brilliance, but also his vulnerability, his ambition, but also his recklessness, his intelligence, but also his instability.
He felt as if his life had been laid bare for public consumption, a story mined for entertainment value rather than understanding. And yet, he could not deny that the attention validated him in a way nothing else had. People recognized his name. They admired what he had achieved, even if they feared it. The world knew who he was, even if it did not know him. Public curiosity reached him in unexpected ways. Sometimes strangers approached him, asking whether he really built a reactor. Sometimes reporters sought him out. Sometimes documentary filmmakers tried to contact him. Most of the time he avoided them. He preferred anonymity, even as the world refused to give him complete freedom from his past. But the attention also reopened questions about his mental state. People wondered how a teenager could have undertaken such a dangerous project alone. They wondered about the pressures he had faced, the isolation, the obsessive qualities of his mind. Some suggested he had been a gifted child, unsupported by the system. Others believed he had been a hazard from the beginning. And in the midst of all this speculation, David himself tried to hold on to some semblance of direction. For a while, he attempted college courses, but they did not hold his interest. He tried vocational training, but the structure did not suit him. He re-entered the military, hoping it would once again impose order on his life, but the regimented environment only highlighted his inner disarray. He wanted to succeed. He wanted to be stable, but the world operated on rules that clashed with the way his mind worked. Slowly, the shadows of untreated psychological challenges took root. His behavior became erratic. He spoke of ideas that others dismissed as unrealistic. His conversations drifted into abstractions that made sense only to him. The boy who had once built a reactor now struggled to build routine. As he entered his late 20s and early 30s, glimpses of the old David flickered occasionally. He still read scientific literature. He still talked passionately about nuclear physics. He still believed he had the potential to accomplish extraordinary things, but the discipline and access he once had were gone. And the fascination with radioactive materials, dormant for a time, never fully disappeared. It resurfaced in small ways at first. He collected smoke detectors again, not with the ambitious aim of building a reactor, but with the compulsive drive of someone trying to recapture a piece of identity long lost. He dismantled them methodically. He extracted tiny americium sources, telling himself he was simply investigating, simply observing, simply experimenting in a harmless way. But the pattern was troubling, and it did not go unnoticed. Neighbors complained about strange noises coming from his apartment. The building superintendent smelled burning plastic and discovered melted smoke detector casings. Authorities were alerted once more. When they arrived, they found evidence of disassembly, scattered tools, and a small stash of materials reminiscent of his teenage experiments. It was nothing like the reactor. No radiation leaked, no structure was contaminated. But the discovery raised old alarms. The officials who intervened realized they were dealing not with a criminal, but with a man haunted by his own past. They saw someone whose mind had once soared beyond its limits and now struggled simply to remain steady. They referred him to mental health services, but resources were limited, follow-through was inconsistent, and David resisted treatment, insisting he could manage on his own. The world that had once celebrated him now pitied him, and he felt the weight of that pity keenly. Yet even as his personal struggles consumed him, the legend of the Radioactive Boy Scout grew. New articles revisited his story. Documentaries featured his case as a symbol of genius turned dangerous. Bloggers debated whether he could have succeeded had he been guided properly. Students wrote essays about him. Scientists discussed him privately with a mixture of awe and disbelief.
People who never spoke his name correctly could recite the details of his reactor. They could describe the shed. They could outline the cleanup. They could quote pieces of the famous article. Some even exaggerated the story, transforming him into a near mystical figure. David Hahn had become a cautionary tale, but also a cultural icon of strange brilliance. And while the world mythologized him, David, the actual man, drifted further from the life he had once dreamed of. The gulf between the legend and the person widened, and as years passed, his own role in shaping the world's fascination with him became blurred. He had built something extraordinary as a boy, but he had not built a future. Yet the final acts of his life would reveal something far more complex than the world imagined, because the story of the Radioactive Boy Scout was not simply about a reactor or a shed or a government cleanup. It was a story about a mind that burned too brightly, too early, without guidance, and the consequences that followed. After the Environmental Protection Agency removed the contaminated shed in 1995 and classified its contents as low-level radioactive waste, David Hahn tried to resume a normal life. He finished high school and moved on from the immediate aftermath of the investigation, though those who knew him later said he remained deeply affected by the attention the incident had brought him. He briefly attended college, but did not complete a degree, and his academic path never settled into anything stable. During these years, there was no documented attempt by him to build another reactor or acquire significant radioactive materials. What is known is that he continued to show fascination with chemistry and nuclear science, though he kept this interest mostly to himself. In the late 1990s, David Hahn enlisted in the United States Navy. Publicly available sources confirm that he served aboard the USS Enterprise, one of the Navy's nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. Although he was assigned to an area connected to the ship's nuclear operations, records and testimonies indicate that he did not handle nuclear materials directly, and that his role was not related to nuclear engineering in any meaningful capacity. His service on the Enterprise lasted a limited period, and after leaving the Navy, he briefly joined the Marine Corps, though he did not complete a full enlistment there. His military service never developed into a long-term career. When he returned to civilian life in Michigan, those close to him began to notice significant changes. Accounts from family members, neighbors, and acquaintances describe increasing signs of paranoia, social isolation, and unstable behavior. He had difficulty holding down regular jobs and lived in a way that suggested growing mental health problems, though no public documentation exists regarding a formal diagnosis. His interest in radioactivity and nuclear topics, while still present, became more scattered and unfocused than in his teenage years. On August 1, 2007, David Hahn came to the attention of authorities again. Police in Clinton Township arrested him after discovering that he had taken and dismantled a number of smoke detectors, more than 16 in total, from locations in or near his apartment building. The charge filed against him was larceny of smoke detectors. Although the immediate issue was theft, the police report and subsequent court documents note that officers were concerned he was attempting once again to extract americium-241, the radioactive isotope found in small quantities in household smoke detectors. Officers who arrested him observed sores and rashes on his face, which David attributed to chemical exposure. The cause of these marks were never confirmed. Investigators searched his residence, but did not find evidence of a reactor, high-level radioactive materials, or an ongoing dangerous experiment. David eventually pleaded guilty to the theft charge and was sentenced to 90 days in jail, including time already served.
The years following his release were marked by increasing instability. The consistent accounts given later by people who knew him indicate that he struggled to maintain employment, often lived in precarious housing situations, and remained socially withdrawn.
his mental health appeared to continue declining, and he did not regain the level of focus or direction he had displayed in his youth. There are no documented incidents of him seeking more radioactive material after 2007, nor did law enforcement agencies report further concerns about nuclear-related activity. His earlier notoriety meant that any attempt to acquire sensitive materials would have drawn immediate attention, but public records indicate no additional cases or investigations. David Hahn died on September 27, 2016, in Shelby Charter Township, Michigan, at the age of 39. According to the official medical examiner's report, the cause of death was acute alcohol intoxication combined with complications from long-term substance abuse. There is no documented connection between his death and radiation exposure or the teenage experiment that had once made him known worldwide. His passing prompted a brief resurgence of media attention, but the available records make clear that his later years were defined not by scientific experimentation, but by personal hardship, instability, and declining health.